Today we're going to be tying LaFontaine's Emergent Sparkle Pupa. Now before we get into tying this and me showing you how I tie it, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the author of this. And his name was Gary LaFontaine. Gary LaFontaine grew up in Connecticut, and he caught his first fish on a fly at the age of 8. And he published his first fly fishing article at the age of 15. Gary went to college in Montana in 1963, majoring in behavioral psychology, and he arranged his class schedule around the hatches of flies that would be on the Clark Fork River. After graduation, Gary returned to Connecticut, where he and his wife did pioneering work preparing mentally retarded children to become self-sufficient. They then moved to Deer Lodge, Montana in 1973, and Gary worked as a guard at the state prison there, and later at the children's ward at the state hospital at Warm Springs, Montana. All during this time, Gary worked also as a guide on area rivers from the Complete Fly Fisher's Lodge near Wise River, Montana. Fishing dominated Gary's life. He fished across the country and much of the world, and one of his favorite rivers was our Gunpowder River here in Maryland. Gary was constantly thinking and observing and innovating and writing about fly fishing. In his first book, which was entitled Challenge of the Trout, which was published in 1976, he began to incorporate observations from his underwater scuba diving, where he would be observing trout and their behavior and how they would prefer one type of a fly over another. Later on, he earned national recognition in his second book, Caddis Flies, shown here, which Gary endorsed for me, autographed for me, back in 1997. That book combined entomology along with his underwater observations of trout and insect behavior and the advent of new fly tying materials and techniques. That book was followed by another called the Dry Fly Book, New Angles, in 1990, and Trout Flies, Proven Patterns in 1993. So you might say that Gary was a specialist, especially when it came to trout fishing. Gary LaFontaine was a fly fisherman in much the same way as Albert Einstein was a mathematician. In his 56 years of life, he achieved much. And in 1996, the issue of Fly Rod and Reel magazine named him the Angler of the Year. Throughout his productive career, he was apparently felt driven to create and to experiment and to write. And in Trout Flies, Proven Patterns, he wrote of fishing for 6 to 12 hours nearly every day in 1991, putting nearly 30,000 miles on his car and wearing out fly lines every 4 weeks. He'd fall asleep at his computer keyboard at night, and his daughter Heather would come out to put a blanket over him. She'd try not to wake him up because she knew that he would get right back at his writing. Gary died on January 4th, 2002, after several years of decline, suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly referred to as ALS or also Lou Gehrig's disease. I met Gary in the late 1990s at a fly show in Baltimore, and he autographed the book that I just showed you to me. Though Gary created over 50 unique fly patterns, his most popular patterns were the Emergent Sparkle Pupa and the Deep Sparkle Pupa. What is unique about Gary's patterns? It was the use of a trilobal, meaning 3-strand yarn, developed by the DuPont Corporation, which incorporated Antron, and that material was called Antron as it was marketed for sewing materials, etc. But one of the first materials that Gary used to incorporate Antron was Aunt Liddy's sparkle yarn. And so he gave it that name, sparkle yarn and sparkle pupa, in his flies. Now, how did Gary fish his emergent sparkle pupa and deep sparkle pupa? I'll talk about that after I've shown you a little bit more about how to tie this fly. All right, so we're just about ready to tie our first emergent sparkle pupa. And as the name denotes, emergent is that Gary was trying to imitate a caddisfly as it emerged from the surface into a dry fly adult. So this pattern incorporates not only the materials that he used, but it's tied in such a fashion that it's basically going to be riding in the surface film just prior to emerging through the surface film into an adult. So the materials that I'm going to be using today is going to be, first of all, a caddis hook. I'm going to be tying on a size 12, but I'm planning on sending size 10 and 12 hooks to each of the recipients of this pattern so that you can do the comparison of size. Some of the species of caddis flies are as large as would be tied on a size 10 hook, whereas others, particularly those that arise later in the season, are going to be probably size 14 or 16. So you would need to tie these flies in several different sizes depending upon what caddisfly is hatching and where you're fishing. The body material that we're going to be using is going to consist of both an underbody and an overbody. The underbody is basically a mix, and I will hold up the mix that I prepared beforehand. It's a mix of sparkle dubbing of two different colors. The particular one we're going to tie today is the brown and gold emergent sparkle pupa, and so it incorporates a little bit of gold sparkle yarn and a little bit of brown. The overbody is strictly the sparkle yarn itself, and that will be in the color gold. After I have tied that part, both the underbody and the overbody, then we'll put in some a small amount of deer hair, and this is Comparadun. It's relatively fine, and I purchased this. This is Hairline, which was purchased from the Fly Shack in New York. So that will be the wing, and then a little bit of dubbing, brown dubbing from my dubbing box here, that will comprise the head. So there's not much to this fly, but the complexity of the fly is what really makes it effective, but it's also something that I'm hoping that each of our tiers will learn about today, and that is the use of touch dubbing method and use of sparkle yarn and tying this emergent caddis pupa. So the first thing I'm going to do, of course, is start my thread, and I'm using size 8/0 tan unithread. And so I'm starting right behind the eye, wrapping back until I get partway around the bend of the hook, about the location where the barb of the hook is beneath where I stop the thread, as you can see. I clip off this extra piece of thread. The next thing I am going to be doing is picking out and I already did this in advance, I have a section of sparkle yarn, which I cut from this pack here. It's gold sparkle yarn. And I'm going to separate a few strands of this away from the remainder of this clump that I'm going to tie in for the tail. It's not really a tail, but it really is a shuck that comes off of the fly as it's emerging. So it's a few strands that comprises the shuck. Take a few of those, clip off a little bit of the tip, hold it right on top of the shank of the hook, make a few wraps, and wrap down the forward part, leaving this tail intact. Now I'm going to trim this a little bit right now in an irregular fashion so that it's not just a straight tail. So it really just looks like part of the shuck of the fly has been already exuded as the fly is emerging through the surface film. I'm then going to take another section of this sparkle yarn, tie it in right on top. I'm first, before I do that, I'm going to bring the thread back to the starting point, and I'm tying in one clump of this on top of the hook immediately above where the tail of the fly was tied in. I use the pinch method to make sure I'm keeping the material up on top. I'm holding this apart from the tail itself for the time being. Now the next thing I'm going to do, which is a little bit more difficult, especially if you do not have a rotary vise, I'm going to flip this over in order to tie in the clump of the sparkle yarn on the underside of the fly. So I'm just going to stop for a minute and reverse the hook in the vise. There we go. As I said, I did that in order for those of you who have a standard vise to realize that the best way to tie in the underbody on the underside of the hook is to reverse the hook in your vise. So I just slip this Antron yarn down over the hook, grasp it between my fingers, that is the thread, make one turn, pull down, and make a couple wraps back. With each turn, I'm bringing this material back closer to the bend of the hook where I want it to be tied in for the underbody. Okay. Now that I've done that, I can reverse this back again. Now that is one of the more difficult parts of this procedure, but it would be good experience for you to realize that there are times that you will want to create some sort of material on the underside of the hook, and so using this approach is going to give you some experience in that. Now, rather than spending time preparing the underbody, which will go on next, I have already chopped up a mixture of 1/2 of the ginger or golden sparkle yarn with 1/2 of a darker material, and you will get both of these in your package. The next thing I do, and of course this is chopped up with fine scissors so that it's really a very loose type of material, much different than what you find in your normal dubbing. And it's very important that you keep it loose, because if you pinch it too tight together, it's just going to clump, and it's going to eliminate the effect that made Gary's flies so popular. So I now have that mixture. The next step that I'm going to be doing is to put a little bit of dubbing wax on the thread, about maybe an inch of it, from perhaps a quarter of the inch where the thread intersects with the hook, and an inch below that. So I'm just going to make 2 light coats, and I am using Orvis dubbing wax. I found this to be pretty good. It's very tacky, and that's what you want. If you buy dubbing wax and it's relatively hard, I would say don't buy it. It should be tacky, because the whole purpose of it is to help you attach material to the threads. And this is about the only fly that I would use dubbing wax on, but nonetheless, here it goes. So I just make like 2 strokes with my dubbing wax. And then the next thing that you'll see me do is I'm going to take some of this dubbing material that I prepared, touch dub, and I hold it between my finger and my thumb, and I just touch it to the thread as such. And I'm not sure that you'll be able to see that clearly, but this is very finely attached, and the dubbing wax is actually holding this in place. So I will make a couple wraps now with this material, starting right where I had tied in the initial sparkle yarn, and just going up the abdomen of the fly. As you see, it stands out, which is what we want, because the light should penetrate through this, creating the glistening body of the caddisfly as it emerges. I'm going to put a little bit more on there. Admittedly, it takes a little bit of practice with this, so when you're doing it, I would expect that you might have to make several trials. Now I'm stopping maybe 1/8 of an inch from the eye, because I want to bring next the overbody and the underbody strands forward and tie them in. Now, notice what I'm doing at this point. I'm picking up this material, not the part that was the tail, which is I'm pointing to right now. The tail material, which was tied in first, I'm leaving that lie in place. And I'm bringing this over almost so it creates an envelope. And then I gently hold this, and I bring my thread up and put it between my thumb and my forefinger, and then pull up, or go around and pull up again. And that will secure it in place. Make several wraps to hold that there. Now, at this point, I can use my bodkin to spread this out a little bit. This is going to create almost like a canopy over the underbody, and that is the part that I dubbed on first. I'm going to lift this up, make a couple wraps here, and then clip it off. So I have a nice clean head at this point. Now I can turn the fly over and do much the same thing that I did on the top. Hold that in place. Use the pinch method to grab the thread. It's a little bit more difficult here, so I'm going to do it this way. Now it's still loose enough that I can draw these fibers up a little bit, like so. Make a few more wraps and trim this off. We've now completed the most difficult parts of this fly. I'm going to make a few more wraps just to be sure that that's secure. Now, for the next step, I will take some of this Comparadun deer hair, and you need very few hairs, probably less than a half dozen. I kind of pull that back from the hide, trim it off. It's not necessary to stack this because, first of all, these are very short fibers, and a little bit of irregularity is not going to hurt you. And as you can see, I started out with twice as much as I need, so I'm actually just going to drop that excess to the side, clip off a little bit of the butts, measure that hair not to go any further back than to the bend of the hook. In fact, I like it a little bit in front of that spot. Again, notice how I'm tying in this deer hair to keep it from wrapping around the shank of the hook. I bring the thread up between my fingers and I go down with a loose wrap, and then I pull up, and that secures the material right on top of the hook. And then I can trim off this extra, make a few more wraps there. And now we're ready for the very last step, and that would be to put a dubbing head on it. So I'm taking some of this. In this particular box of superfine dubbing, it's just labeled brown dubbing. So for this pattern, as Gary has described it, we use a little bit of brown dubbing for the head. Now, when I mean a little, I'm talking about a very small amount. So I would just take a few strands and dub the thread, make a few wraps of that to create that dubbed head, and then use my half-hitch tool to finish off the fly. There we go. So, there we have completed the brown emergent sparkle pupa. Okay, well, I hope that you learned a little bit about how to tie Gary LaFontaine's emergent sparkle pupa today. Now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what colors to use and how to fish this fly. In Gary's book, The Caddisflies that I talked about, he describes the more prevalent patterns that he would recommend tying based upon what genus of the caddisflies are hatching in this particular areas. And as I mentioned to you, he was an expert on the Gunpowder River, which obviously is close enough for any of us to fish over near Baltimore. And two of the genus or genera of caddisflies that hatch on the Gunpowder, one is the Brachiocentris, and that is the one that is brown and bright green. And the other is Hygrophitch, which is brown and yellow. And the one that I tied today is actually the brown and yellows, as you would notice. And I'm going to hold up the two flies, this one being the brown and green, and this being the brown and yellow, which I tied today. Of course, this one was tied in a size 10, and this one is in a size 12. So we will be sending you both hook sizes, but enough material for you to tie two of the brown and yellow emergent sparkle pupas for your fly box. I would recommend that you have some of the dubbing wax. You can pick up dubbing wax at any of the fly shops. You can also get it online, probably. It's very common. Now, I'm not saying that there's a whole lot of patterns for you to use dubbing wax for, but you definitely need something that's tacky like this. Perhaps something like mustache wax might do also, but I've always followed Gary's recommendations, and I've used the true dubbing wax that's sold by Orvis and a number of other companies. So how do we fish this? Well, you might note that I said at the beginning of our presentation today that Gary's two favorite patterns, or the two most popular, were his Emergent Sparkle Pupa, which I tied for you today, and a Deep Sparkle Pupa. The only difference being the Deep Sparkle Pupa is tied without a tail and without a wing. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same thing. Sometimes the body of that is, or the shank of the hook is weighted slightly so that it would ride deeper. But when the caddisflies start hatching, you can imagine that they are coming up from the bottom of the stream, or as a pupa. They begin to emerge. And so at that point, you might want to fish the Deep Sparkle Pupa. Or if you're already seeing that the caddisflies are on the surface hatching, then you might want to use the Emergent. Or you can use a combination of the two. And I have commonly done that, in which case my upper fly, which is riding just under the surface, my primary lead fly is going to be the Emergent Sparkle Pupa, and what's following it is the Deep Sparkle Pupa. Now, you could either use these two as a combination in the same color variation, or as a searching pattern, you might want to use one of the brown and green and one of the just green, bright green. The other thing that I will commonly do is I will use a surface fly as an attractor, a dry fly, and behind it I will attach either the Emergent Sparkle Pupa or the Deep Sparkle Pupa. So don't hesitate to try different combinations. When you do have a caddis hatch on the stream, and many of them even here locally in the Frederick area, such as the streams in the mountains nearby and in Western Maryland, all have rather prolific caddis hatches. One of my favorite is the Castleman River, and I always try to fish these patterns when I know that the caddisflies are hatching out there in Western Maryland. I hope that you were able to enjoy today's session. I hope that you learned something, and particularly how to use this type of touch dubbing method, which can be used for other types of flies. This doesn't need to be the only way that you use touch dubbing. It was a unique method developed by Gary, and it also has made his flies very unique and very popular. Thank you for being with us today. Tight lines.